2017's The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was an open-world masterpiece. While it itself borrows liberally from multiple games that came out before it, it packaged what it borrowed with a healthy dose of its own innovations as well as popularizations of existing concepts, just to create a truly potent game that was unlike any other game in over a decade, if not longer. From its ridiculous interactivity, thanks to the underpinning chemistry and physics engines that allow for unique and mind-blowing solutions to problems and encounters in the game to this day, to its emphasis on mobility and traversal, with its climb anywhere functionality and gliding being of special note, to its diegetic world design based on visual landmarks to guide player navigation and exploration as opposed to HUD markers, or a ton of annoying map icons. Breath of the Wild was a revelation. The industry agreed. In the 5 years since Breath of the Wild came out, it has continued to win rave acclaim, topping all-time games lists quite frequently. Continued to win players' hearts across the world, selling millions of copies at full price every year in an industry where games older than a few weeks have trouble selling. Portending a naturally strong word of mouth, and being cited by multiple developers and publishers as an inspiration for their own games, some of which have gone on to become open-world masterpieces in their own right. Today on Gaming Bolt, we're going to take a look at 10 of those games. Ghosts of Tsushima. Ghosts of Tsushima isn't a game you would ordinarily associate with Breath of the Wild. It's ultimately structured and plays like a highly polished take on the modern open-world template more than it resembles Zelda. However, while its structure may hew closer to modern games, the in-game navigation takes a lot of cues from Breath of the Wild, with diegetic cues and visual landmarkers within the world to guide the player without the need of visible HUD markers. From plumes of smoke you can see from the distance that inevitably lead to points of interest, to landmarks and platforming challenges, to even more diegetic takes on explicit navigation aids such as wildlife, including birds and foxes, and even the wind to guide you where you're going. Sucker Punch hasn't been shy about the Zelda influence either. Creative director Nate Fox has enthusiastically shared just how much Breath of the Wild influenced the development of Ghost of Tsushima multiple times, often unprompted, noting that the release of Nintendo's masterpiece energized Sucker Punch and allowed them to approach existing open-world tropes from a fresh perspective. It seems to have paid off because Ghost of Tsushima was a wonderful game. One we can't wait to see a follow-up to, hopefully sometime soon. Genshin Impact. Genshin Impact is probably among the most overtly inspired by Breath of the Wild games on this list. Of games inspired by Breath of the Wild, so that really is saying something. It features a similar world, both visually and in terms of design. Similar navigation down to stamina-governed climbing and a glider. And the developers have even explicitly admitted the inspiration and similarities multiple times. Of course, like most great games manage, Genshin Impact takes the framework of Zelda and delivers its own unique take on it, with a more magic combat-focused world less reliant on the emergent opportunities afforded by Breath of the Wild's chemistry engine. In favor of delivering something with denser RPG systems, it manages to deliver something great and unique to it, while still being visibly inspired by Zelda. And it does all of this while being free to play. Immortals: Fenyx Rising. Immortals: Fenyx Rising is the developer's own open-world take on Breath of the Wild's brilliance. And you know what? While you might expect them to miss out on a lot of what makes Breath of the Wild such a beloved and enduring game, Immortals gets a shocking amount right. Now, to be fair, a lot of what it gets right it takes directly from Zelda. From its world puzzles to stamina-governed climbed anywhere, gliding, physics-based puzzles, and even powers that resemble Zelda's stasis and magnesis to a suspicious degree. But it has a lot of its own things to add to the table. From an arguably superior combat system to a stronger emphasis on story, which leads to some incredibly witty and sharp dialogue and characterization along the way. Immortals isn't a great game, but it doesn't need to be that. It's very good, and it delivers a more palatable take on Breath of the Wild's structure and systems, standing out edges such as the latter's infamously fragile weapons, while also diluting some of its core design brilliance. Halo Infinite. The original pitch for Halo Infinite, according to Bloomberg's deep dive into the game's year-long development cycle, was a Breath of the Wild-style open-world Halo game. The game we did end up getting doesn't quite deliver on the promise. Halo Infinite is an amazing game, don't get me wrong, but it's not amazing because it contains much of Zelda's DNA in it. While it went open world and emphasized player-driven solutions to encounters and problems by re-emphasizing a physics-governed sandbox like the Halo games of old, And like Zelda itself imbibed, the open world itself resembles a modern world more than Zelda, with a map full of icons and points of interest clearly marked out, overt in-game navigation assistance, and no shortage of outposts to clear out. The diegetic design of Zelda's world, which induced player exploration, is nowhere to be found in Halo Infinite as it released, but you can still see that initial pitch, particularly in the way that encounters now allow so much variation and player agency in how they are approached. Pokemon Legends Arceus. After a decade of disappointing fans, Pokemon finally delivered a title that was largely, overwhelmingly positively received by the fanbase with Pokemon Legends Arceus, a game that finally delivers on the promise of an open-world Pokemon game inspired by Breath of the Wild that fans have been asking for half a decade now. Adopting a similarly streamlined and minimalist attitude to its own series conventions as Breath of the Wild did to Zelda, Legends delivers a game that offers a similar player-driven gameplay loop, with your character being dropped in the wilderness and then deciding on their own path through it based on what catches their interest, and how they chose to deal with it once it does. Legends takes a lot from Breath of the Wild, from the graphical and musical stylings to the UI, crafting mechanics, world design, navigation, and traversal abilities, including being able to climb anywhere and gliding, to even sound cues and effects that sound directly taken from that game. And it's that much better for it too. Pokemon's first brush with open world gameplay was a triumph, and with the future of the franchise seemingly firmly packed in the open world arena, it will be interesting to see just how much Game Freak continues to borrow from Nintendo's open world masterpiece going forward. Oceanhorn 2, Knights of the Lost Realm. Oceanhorn 2, much like many other games on the list, is not shy about its Zelda influences, which it wears proudly on its sleeve. It is very clearly inspired not just by Breath of the Wild, but by classic Zelda games as well. But it is Breath of the Wild that is most evident in this indie action-adventure title, from how the protagonist looks, with the blue outfit recalling a certain iconic champion's tunic, to its open-world exploration. And yet, it still retains a lot of classic Zelda as well, from dungeons to combat to even a lot of what you get for your inventory, a lot of which resembles classic Zelda games every bit as much as it does Breath of the Wild. Ultimately, Zelda fans who are looking for something more traditional will find Oceanhorn 2 to be an intriguing proposition, while those who were let down by Breath of the Wild's emphasis on the open world over the series' tried and tested primacy of dungeons will find a lot to like here as well. Windbound. Windbound is another indie open world game that heavily borrows from Breath of the Wild, from the art style and aesthetic to the minimalist music, to the mechanics such as gliding and crafting and weapon durability. Yep, even that one made it through. To even some inventory and HUD elements. This isn't a bad thing either, as we have established through this entire list, if you're going to borrow from a game, you might as well borrow from something as brilliant as Zelda is. Of course, Windbound also adds its own riffs to the formula, with roguelike elements, necessitating a total reset of the map, including its layout, every time you die, adding some intriguing twists to the now defined and established formula. The Pathless. It's actually surprising how many indie titles went ahead and decided to try and emulate Breath of the Wild, given how much effort clearly can go into crafting a world as diegetic, handcrafted, interactive, and massive as Zelda's Hyrule in its 2017 game. It's why we have seen very few of them, and indeed very few games in general, try to replicate Breath of the Wild's wholesale. Most seem to focus on a few specific things from that game, and then double down on them, while adding their own twist to the formula. The Pathless is another one of those games along those lines, with its open world design relying on its diegetic cues for player navigation, similar aesthetic in terms of visuals and music, and even a very similar kind of minimalist environmental storytelling. It does all of this while also providing a much more compact experience. A small, but ultimately incredibly satisfying and unforgettable sojourn through its haunting world, one that stays with you long after you're done with it. Horizon Forbidden West. Horizon Zero Dawn was the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild's first victim. Zero Dawn launched just a few days before Zelda, and ended up being completely overshadowed by the latter's lightning in a bottle take on open world design, which made Horizon's more traditional style open world game seem dated in comparison to many. With the sequel, Guerrilla Games sought to take cues from Zelda, including, most obviously, adding a glider to Aloy's traversal arsenal, and also attempting to expand on the climbing and mobility she's capable of. Generally, however, Forbidden West sticks to what worked about the original game, from a gorgeous world and a mysterious story, to some thrilling combat against imaginative enemy designs, most of which are elements that Nintendo's game fails to deliver on. But it does freshen up its more traditionally structured open world by paying some lip service to the game that sucked all of the air out of the room right around when its predecessor came out. Elden Ring. Elden Ring takes every single thing that players loved about Breath of the Wild and addresses almost all the shortcomings players have complained about with that game in the years since. Elden Ring has fully fledged labyrinthian dungeons, each every bit as well designed as the dungeons in the classic, more linear Dark Souls games. All of this is done while retaining Zelda's diegetic world navigation, similar player-driven points of interest identification, and a similar approach to how mapping is handled. Elden Ring does lose some of what made Zelda so brilliant. The sheer level of interactivity found throughout the world is gone. And unlike in Zelda, where every single problem offered a near infinite possible solutions, the answer to everything in Elden Ring is to die or to kill. Of the games mentioned today on Gaming Bolt, which will be the next to inspire a slew of new open world games? Let us know in the comments below, and while you're here, leave a like and check out some of the other videos on the side here.